And here we come back to 16, which was touched on earlier with Mr. Brown.
Yes, so this is a proposal.
Excuse me, with Mr. Hacker.
A proposal we had in the May revision to move forward and reopen a Magalia conservation camp that's in Butte County, and this would be a joint effort between the Conservation Corps and CAL FIRE to not only train California Conservation Corps youth that are involved in the program, but also help with critical fire needs in Northern California. The proposal is for $3.1 million in the budget year, growing to $3.6 million in the out years.
$3.6 million in the out years? Mr. Hacker, you agree with that estimate?
Excuse me. Our understanding would be that it would be $3.1 million in 15-16 related to the renovation of the camp to bring it up to code and allow it to open. 3.6 in 16-17 for both ongoing operations and the acquisition of equipment, and then roughly 3.1 million ongoing past that.
Thank you. And your take on the Senate's response to the governor's proposal?
So the Assembly approved his budget. The Senate reduced the proposal by $1,000 to send this to conference, and we recommend the Assembly version, as the Butte Fire Unit, where this camp would be located, is the only CAL FIRE unit that doesn't currently have a residential camp, which has hindered their ability to respond to fires there in the past. So we believe that this camp would allow them to better serve that region.
Do you think there's anything premature about this? I understand that the Conservation Corps is proposing to evaluate the entirety of the residential facilities expansion, that we might wait for what they have to say, I think, come January before we make any further decisions.
They have proposed to explore the expansion of their residential facility, but it's our understanding that the Corps has already made the decision to convert what is currently a non-residential facility in Chico to a residential facility at the Magalia camp. So they are already planning to have this unit going forward.
Okay. Senator Nielsen, I think this is in your district.
Well, and Assemblyman Dawes, too. I just have to kind of paint a picture of what we're talking about here. It's an area largely populated by retired folks. It's up in above the timberline, or a lot of it is, and a beautiful place. The difficulty, it's all on a ridge, and there are two canyons on either side, and there's really only one major way to get out. And over the years that I've represented it, we've had fires and we've had snows up there that have hugely been problematic, particularly one about 2 years ago. And this is really critical to the public safety and to respond. And obviously in this year with the fire danger being so much greater, and what happens in those canyons is the winds come and it sweeps through the canyon and drives the fire. And with that many people up there, this is really an important consideration. CAL FIRE has worked with the community on such things as the lookout tower up there. A lot of the folks wanted to maintain the lookout tower, and CAL FIRE has given different options, one of which is cameras out there to do the surveillance of the smoke so that they don't have to man that. But my point is, this is something that, you know, it can wait, but we're putting a lot of people at risk to wait. That's my point, Mr. Chair.
Senator, do I take that as a motion for the Assembly? All right, we have a motion for the Assembly, 3-0 on the Senate side, 3-0 on the Assembly.
As you may or may not know, the state is currently in the process of reviewing how to replace what are very old at this point Vietnam-era helicopters with more modern helicopters for our CAL FIRE firefighting fleet. And we propose, the governor's budget proposes budget bill language that would have CAL FIRE and DGS work collaboratively on a procurement and contract process for the replacement of CAL FIRE's existing helicopter fleet. We definitely recognize the sensitivity of this. This is a very high ticket item as procurement goes, but they really are critical to modernizing and ensuring that our CAL FIRE fleet is able to work at full capacity during the fire seasons. With the fourth year of drought, we continue to be concerned that this fire year will be particularly bad, and there are already more fires at this time of year than there have been in many years prior. So we actually are a bit concerned with we are concerned with the Senate's version of the budget bill language, and do think that it would jeopardize our procurement process.
And Ms. Ames, your take on the Senate proposal?
Yes. The Assembly did reject the proposed language. The Senate also rejected it and adopted alternative budget bill language that requires CAL FIRE to return in January 2016 with a proposal that includes 3 different options for replacing the existing fleet, and the different options would have various capabilities and costs that would allow the legislature to weigh these trade-offs among them. And so our recommendation is to go with the Senate version. We think the alternative budget bill language does provide the legislature with additional information and added oversight through a procurement process that will ultimately end up costing the state, in the low hundreds of millions of dollars.
Ms. Bosler did acknowledge this could be costly. Ms. Bosler, no need for legislative involvement in this?
No, I think that's not in the intent at all. I do think, though, that given that there are limited numbers of vendors, it's, I think, very sensitive, and to the extent that there's a lot more back and forth that we have to do, I think there's some jeopardy about our ability to negotiate the best prices. I think that's our main concern.
I think there's a concern about the Senate language. No, they want to hold it open. Okay. Hold it open.
Senator Nielsen.
Mr. Chairman, I've been very fussy about this in terms of acquisitions, upgrading their fleets to the various agencies. And in this particular case, this language was put in by the Senate. I think it's very reasonable that they come to us with a concrete plan. It's just not giving them a blank check to go do what they want. So I would argue that the Senate makes good budgetary sense and frankly, good public safety sense, too.
Thank you. Assemblyman Bloom.
Thank you. Well, my committee has been pressing on this issue since I got here 3 years ago in every budget cycle, and we're actually very gratified that the process is now moving forward. We think it's extremely important that this move forward expeditiously, and we don't think, frankly, and my read of this is that there's not a blank check being offered. There is going to be oversight of the process through the subcommittee proceedings, but we're faced with a situation where we are using Vietnam-era helicopters. There is only, as I understand it, if I recall from the most recent subcommittee hearing, there's only 1 spare engine left, and it's really time that we move forward on these. The modern technology options that are out there include things like night vision capabilities, which will allow the helicopters, which they do not currently have the capacity to fight fires during the daytime hours and the nighttime hours. So this is extremely important, and I think we need to make sure that we're moving it forward expeditiously, and I think that's why we are asking to hold this open and hopefully move to the Assembly version. But if there's a compromise out there, we'll be happy to consider it.
We will do just that as we move to page 18.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Nielsen.
Let me make an offer on that and understand, too, folks, that the acquisition of these new helicopters is going to require a lot of facility changes, too, to accommodate the repair and maintenance of them. But understanding the need, I think we have to have a report and a plan. But I would not be adverse to CAL FIRE proceeding with the acquisition of a set number, 2 or 3 or whatever, for this emergency period of time. But they don't just get a blank check to go ahead and purchase the whole fleet. If we could determine a set number in the next few hours that would be required, I'd be okay to approve that and then require that the report come to us and we make the decision to proceed from that on.
Thank you for the suggestion. Clearly, we have some more deliberation on this. Moving on to increased salmon production.
Mr. Chair, there's been some change, obviously, in this proposal, so we would move the governor's proposal, which is no proposal at all.
So it's, in effect, a motion to reject.
Reject.
All right. On the Senate side, 3-0. Assembly, 3-0. Thank you, Assemblywoman. Page 19 is the expansion of scientific programs. Governor's proposal. Ms. Bosler. That's all right.
This was a proposal in the governor's budget for $4.8 million in reimbursement authority for many critical scientific programs at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, including 32 limited term position or 32 positions. This was a January proposal, so it still said limited term. So 32 positions, but the funding would be limited term.
Thank you. Ms. Early.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. Virginia Early Legislative Analyst Office. We're recommending the Assembly version of this. It's our understanding that there was some concern about the component of this proposal that dealt with the interagency ecological programs research that was intended to inform water decision-making, including BDCP. This component of the proposal cost $600,000 and funded 3 of those 32 positions Ms. Bosler mentioned. While BDCP has ended, the workload that was proposed to inform BDCP will continue to be necessary under California Eco-Restore and Water Fix. Moreover, the non-BDCP workload needs that this proposal addresses continue to exist.
I would just note that much of this of the scientific programs are really the underpinning of the science that's needed to manage sensitive species in the Delta and elsewhere in California, and the studies are really necessary regardless of other projects that are still being discussed.
Ms. Early, what would be the downside if, as the Senate subcommittee suggested, that we just wait until the department resubmits a revised proposal in January?
So 19 of the positions that this proposal funds would go towards regulatory review and permitting activities. So for example, advising entities on CEQA, lake and streambed alterations, activities around protecting endangered species. And so these are positions that local entities such as the Metropolitan Water District and others have said that they're willing to fund positions so that their projects don't slow down. So if the legislature were to reject this proposal and the entirety of the proposal and come back in January, that would just mean that some of those ongoing projects that require this regulatory review and permitting would be slowed down.
Thank you. Senator Lara.
Mr. Chair, I move the Assembly recommendation.
Okay. There is a motion for the Assembly's version. We have 2-1 and 2-1. Page 20 has to do with Clear Lake and its restoration. This was a Senate proposal. Ms. Early. Mr. Brown. Welcome.
Thank you. Brian Brown, Legislative Analyst Office. I'll take this one. Both houses approved about $1 million from the Fish and Game Preservation Fund. The Assembly $1 million, the Senate slightly less, $998,000 for restoration activities at Clear Lake. We know that just a marginal difference. Clearly, both houses had an interest in this work. We would just note that the fund, the Fish and Game Preservation Fund, does have an ongoing structural imbalance. It's certainly sufficient to cover the cost in the budget year, but just want to make you aware of that ongoing issue.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Any thought that we might use the Harbors and Watercrafts Fund, which I told removes invasive species, and that's one of the things that's challenging Clear Lake?
You know, that is right. Invasive species is one of the issues there. We haven't looked at that particular fund, but it sounds like it probably would be allowable. We could certainly look at that more closely and get back to the committee.
All right. If there are no other questions, I think we'll leave this open. I've heard from any number of colleagues that...
We're agreeable to accepting the Senate version on this matter.
You are? Okay.
Oh, we're not. I'm sorry. No, sorry about that.
Well, I don't know if you're going to reduce it by the 2,000.
That's what I thought. Okay. Hold it open.
I think there are still some questions to answer, so
Mr.
we'll do
Chairman?
that. Senator Nielsen.
If I may, on that point, I don't represent Lake County now. I did for a brief time a year and a half ago, and I did for 12 years before that. This is a very real problem up there. I'm not going to argue that the preservation fund is the best source, but I will argue that they have a problem, and I'm willing to consider that fund as a part of it. But again, it'll be left open. We'll take another look at it soon.
Thank you, sir. We will do just that. Page 21, Choice Creek Restoration. This was an Assembly proposal. Mr. Brown?
Yes, so this is $6 million from the general fund proposed by the Assembly for restoration activities at Choyas Creek in San Diego County. We're recommending Senate, which is no funding for this activity. And that's really, while the restoration activities probably have a lot of merit, we don't have a lot of information at this point on what particular activities would be funded, as well as how, therefore, how to compare the proposed activities here versus all the other restoration activities that could be undergone throughout the state. And then we'd also note that these particular restoration activities potentially could be funded from other sources that are being made available in the budget, whether that's Proposition 1 funding or even cap and trade funding, which is going towards wetlands and other restoration activities.
That's the answer to the question I was going to ask you, is whether general fund should be the source at this time. It's also, just to note, one-time request.
I believe it's just a one-time.
Right. Assemblywoman Weber, I know this is near and dear to you.
Right, this is, I think this creek runs really through most of San Diego and has had limited attention to it and has various kinds of, I guess, benefits as well as detriments to the ocean in terms of its pollution and not being adequately maintained. Currently, I think it currently runs through the 80th district, but the interesting thing, of course, is that there's a community group that's basically getting ready to do one of the worst-looking Ys in San Diego, and is getting ready to do and has been engaged in fundraising forever, only to now be saddled with this renovation that was not in the plan because it's right next to their Y and children, and the creek, when it rains, just floods everything, and it basically endangers some of the children in the local community who play nearby. So there was a great concern that we might be able to do something to mitigate the impact of this creek. I think years ago, the state did fund some aspects in Choyas Creek because it does run almost throughout the entire city of San Diego to the ocean and was polluting a lot of the sea urchin and the plants at that point, people dumping oil and what have you. And various parts of it have had some renovation done to it, but there's a major section that doesn't have anything done. And even the most recent rain that we had, which wasn't huge, it flooded and knocked down trees and did all kinds of things because there's no bank for it. There's nothing that's been done. So the city estimates that's the cost of it. And so we're trying to help push this project along in this community. So we'll look into the other sources. We'll hold this open, but it is a creek that runs really throughout most of San Diego. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Mr. Brown, you had mentioned Prop 1 water quality funds. I'm not sure if you also suggested possibly waste discharge permit fund?
I hadn't suggested that, but that potentially could be a possibility. I think it depends on the nature of the pollution source.
All right, to be continued. Page 22 is our Climate Ready program, again, from the Senate. Mr. Brown.
If I could, I'll wait for my colleague.
Okay.
Ms. Ames to arrive.
Ms. Ames, you're up. I understand you may have a compromise, too.
Yes. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The Senate did approve $2.5 million from the Ocean Protection Trust Fund, which would be supported through Thailand's oil revenue that has been previously discussed. To continue the Climate Ready Grant Program, the Assembly did not take an action on this item. This is related to a budget item from last year. The 2014-15 budget established the Climate Resilience Account, and that was to provide additional funding to address the risks and impacts of climate change. And at that time, $2.5 million was transferred from the Environmental License Plate Fund into that account to fund these activities. So for 15-16, the Senate did approve the same amount as is in the current year, but from the Ocean Protection Trust Fund. We do have a compromise on this item. We found that the proposed activities were reasonable and there was significant demand for these grants in the current year. However, since the Thailand's oil revenue does currently go to the general fund, and this would reduce general fund revenue, we have proposed a lower amount at $1.25 million.
But to stay with the funding source?
Yes.
All right. So the compromise is to cut the Senate proposal by a little more than half. Why not half? 1.2 is enough. All right.
They wanted to hold this, they wanted to hold this one open. There may be some other source of funding as well.
All right, we'll keep looking. Senator Nielsen, did you have a comment on this? All right. All right. So we'll keep page 22 open for now. Page 23 is the implementation of the new California Environmental Quality Act requirements. Governor's proposal.
Yes, this is the other component of the proposal we discussed during the CAL FIRE budget. This is to implement AB 52 that had several different requirements related to additional consultations with tribes related to CEQA. This funding here is for additional positions at the Native American Heritage Commission, as well as monies to implement a new database of cultural and historical agencies, and we still are working on the details related to this new IT project. So we also provide some budget bill language to ensure that the routine IT planning processes are followed with this new project.
Thank you, Ms. Bosler and Ms. Ames.
Yes, we have a compromise that's similar to the one for the previous IT project that was discussed. Our understanding is this project is in a similar stage in its progress, and so we've just proposed budget bill language that's slightly modified to include review by the Joint Legislative Committee prior to expenditure of the funds.
All right, so we do have the compromise, which will include some Joint Legislative Budget Committee review.
And we support the compromise.
Good to know. Thank you, Ms. Bosler. Assemblywoman Melendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So can I just ask, have you contemplated what type of delays that additional step would add to the whole process?
The addition of the JLBC review?
Yes.
In the language that we provided, which is the handout that was just passed out, the JLBC would have 30 days to review it between the time that the Department of Technology gave their final approval and the funds were available to be expended. So potentially, if they took the full time and the department was ready to spend them the moment that it was approved by the Department of Technology, it could possibly be 30 days.
Okay, so it would add a delay. And the reason I ask is I know that there were promises made when AB 52 was passed that there would not be any delays for development. And it seems to me that the compromise, though much appreciated, would indeed do the exact opposite of what was promised in that bill. So I mean, I'm fine with the Assembly proposal minus the compromise, because I think it does add time to the whole process, which was not what was, promised when we passed that bill.
Ms. Bosler, do you have a response to that?
I will note that the statute does require the database to be complete by January 1, 2016. Work is well underway as the bill was passed and signed last fall and implemented January 1. So there's a lot of groundwork that's been done waiting for these additional resources. So I think that we're comfortable with the notification. It is a 30-day review period typically. We don't think that it should jeopardize the implementation of this on time.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I would argue that it would jeopardize the time, and I think we should probably contemplate that very carefully. I think on paper it might look like it's not that big of a deal, but it will be.
All right. Assemblywoman Weber.
Yeah, we're prepared to accept the LAO compromise to move this item along.
All right, so
the funding.
motion for the compromise, Senate will be 3-0, Assembly will 2-1. Yes. And we're going to go back very briefly to page 22, Assemblywoman Weber.
We'll move the LAO compromise.
All right, so that LAO compromise was to cut the 2.5 million down to 1.2 million, using same source of funds. The Senate side, 2-1. Assembly side, 2-1. That takes us to page 24. Statutory shift of repatriation responsibility, a May revision proposal.
Yes, this was a technical adjustment. The Repatriation Oversight Commission has not been operating for many years now, and so the proposal is to take the responsibilities that are at that Repatriation Oversight Commission and just shift them to the Native American Heritage Commission, which is clearly a commission that's that will be able to implement the requirements in current law.
Is this a policy issue?
It is a policy issue. I think we saw it as a technical cleanup of sorts that should be non-controversial.
All right, Ms. Ames.
Yes, thank you. As noticed, the trailer bill language was part of the May revised proposal, and there wasn't a lot of time to review it at that time, and we thought it could possibly go through the policy process, which it still could. But at this time, we've had a little bit more time with it. It does seem like a reasonable way to ensure that the responsibilities that are currently under the Repatriation Oversight Commission could be fulfilled, and the Assembly did approve it.
Good. I'm glad you had some time to give it appropriate review. Any comments from the committee? Senator Nielsen.
Mr. Chairman, I'll offer the Central California Flood Control Association has some very serious concerns about the proposal, the lack of due process in this mediation. And this happens in many cases in legislation, some of which we'll be dealing with a little bit later related to groundwater, but there's given agencies real power but without any due process. I think that's a fatal flaw, and therefore I could not support any of this till we have that cleared up, due process.
All right. Senator Lara, LAO has had a chance to review the proposal and thinks that in fact the policy is technical to some degree and worthy of support.
Okay, we'll move the Assembly version.
Okay, so we do have a motion for Assembly. 2-1 on the Senate side, 2-1.
The room's at the room.
Oh, we will keep that open.
You'll be back.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you keeping it open just a little bit to work on. My concern is if we can't reach some kind of acceptable compromise, we're going to delay some very necessary flood control projects in the Central Valleys, plural. And so I hope we can work on it.
I just want to confirm page 24.
I am on 24, yeah, page 24. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I'm right, page 24.
Page 24.
It is about the review process and delaying the construction, and that's really important. And so there has to be some due process built in here for those people subjected to it. That is the concern of the flood control folks. And if we're not careful, we could delay some of the flood control project. We'll work with you on some maybe compromise if we can find any.
Ms. Bosler, do you have a response?
If I can just clarify and maybe address some of Senator Nielsen's concerns on the Repatriation Oversight Commission, PBL. So these are no new authorities for the Native American Heritage Commission. These are all existing authorities that currently exist for the ROC. We're simply shifting those duties to a commission that is funded and appropriate to carry out those duties.
I understand that, and I'm not being critical of that new authority, but I'm saying that we have experienced some recent problems with an extended process of discussion, if you will, and negotiation on the repatriation. And I'm very sensitive to that. So until we, do something with the due process, I'm very reluctant to support this.
Okay. Appreciate your sensitivity to this. I still have a comfort level with the assurances that we've gotten from the Department of Finance. We do have a motion for the Assembly version on page 24. It's a 2-1 vote on the Senate side and a 2-1 vote on the Assembly side.